Hello, welcome to Automation Hour. This is our 31st episode, and I have here with me my co-host David Litton and Rakesh Gupta, and our guest presenter Brian Kwong, MVP Brian Kwong. So for those who are new, joining us for the first time, all lines are muted, and please use the chat function to ask questions, whether it's regarding Brian's presentation or any general process automation questions you might have. If we do not get to your question, we will continue that discussion on the Trailblazer community, and we will be posting a link to the deck as well as the recording after today's session. All right, so Brian will kick off our advanced series and actually end us for the year, and then we will pick back up in January with MVP Doug Ayers and MVP Francis Pindar for the month of January. And then in February and onwards, we have exciting presenters on here. Tune in on February 16th. We're pretty excited with this. We will have Senior Director, Product Manager of Process Automation, Alex Edelson, on to cover off on the Spring 18 process automation enhancements. So he will be on to demo those changes. We have a couple of people representing Boston, Doug Bennett and Amanda. She's the Boston User Group co-leader. We have some powerhouse MVPs joining us, Lena Shell Feldman and Bonnie Hinder. She's been on as well as some community folks who will be joining us for the first time, Amy Ashley, Shannon, and Michael Barnes. We are still interested in gathering additional presenters for the remaining half of 2018. So if you do have any cool automation solutions, submit your ideas to us and we will be in contact. And we have to give a shout out to our sponsor, Concrete.io, for sponsoring this free webinar series for us to be able to share with the community. And here are your co-hosts, David, myself, and Rakesh, and this was from the most recent Dreamforce. And we're really excited to have Brian on. He is the Salesforce wizard of process automation. I actually attended a lot of Brian's sessions at Dreamforce 2015. I think you thought I was stalking you, Brian. But Brian was one of the resources that I used when I was beginning to learn about Process Builder and Flow. So I'm really excited to have Brian on here. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Brian.
Thanks, Jen. You know, I do remember that year where it seemed like you were stalking me every single Dreamforce session I had. And I was okay with that. I tried to do it to you this year, but every time I was going to go to one of your sessions, I had a conflict. I was very disappointed. But thank you, everyone, for joining, especially considering it's the week before winter break for many people. As Jen mentioned, I am a Salesforce MVP. I am the VP of Delivery Operations over Better Partners, a Salesforce implementation partner. And I do a whole bunch of stuff. I got a blog out there. I do a podcast with Mark Ross, and often we talk about automation and flow. I also have a YouTube link out there for kind of trying to get you into flow from a light end to a more advanced stuff. So if that's something that you are looking to learn, that's a nice resource. And what I'm going to talk about today is one of the subjects that I get a lot of questions about, and those are around SObject variables, as well as the collections for SObject variables, and then about looping within flow. Out of everything I think I've ever presented on, these are the three things that constantly come back over and over and over again. Then I'll do a little demo, and of course I have to have the blatant self-promotion because, well, it's almost required at this point in my life. So what is an SObject variable? Well, back in the day, I used to refer to SObject variables as kind of like a writable CD. And then someone made a mention that they had no idea what I was talking about. Not only did that make me feel old, but it forced me to have to come up with the new metaphor. And so my metaphor is that it's really just like a song. And if you think about a song, it has lots of different components. There's instruments, you have the music itself, and then you have the vocals. And just like a song, an SObject variable essentially represents a single record in Salesforce, which each of the fields representing a component of that variable. So if you were to replace the instruments, music, and vocals with the account name, account type, and account website, you essentially have an SObject variable. These are really useful within Flow to be able to do a lot of data manipulation, either pulling the data to do something with it or updating a record without having to have tons of extra variables in the system just to store the values. So if an SObject variable is an individual song, well, that means that the collection represents your playlist. And this is a shout out to Apex and the Limits. If you haven't listened to them, they're a fantastic parody band. And all it really is a collection is a series of different SObject variables. And when we are doing something with that collection, we're typically taking it through a loop, and we are essentially playing each song individually to do something. You know, in the case of my playlist, I'm here to enjoy the music. But in the case of my SObject variable collection of Flow, I'm here to either take pieces of information from the record or update that particular record that's within the collection. And that brings us to loops. So there's two types of loops. There's the one that I kind of call element loop, which doesn't actually have the loop element in it. It's just a group of different elements. And there's always going to be an input screen for basically saying, hey, user, what do you want to do? At which point there will be a decision to say, do you need to continue within the loop? If the decision says, yes, you need to continue a loop, you go through the entire loop until you essentially return back to your original input screen. So you can see we have this nice little loop of elements where it's just going back and forth, where the ultimate decision is going to be, do I continue or do I leave the loop? Now, there's a couple of things when you're looping within Flow, or actually just in Salesforce in general, you should never be doing any type of record actions that are doing things like updating, deleting, or creating. And the reason for that is because it can make you hit limits really, really quickly. So it's a common thing that people end up doing, and they don't realize until it's put into the real world, and you have lots of people running lots of different records through it, that you're quickly going to hit those limits. Next, we have our loop element. So it looks very similar to the element looping, with the exception that a loop element is really there to loop through collections. So typically what it is for me is to loop through an SObject collection or an SObject variable collection. You know, some of the reasons why you might do this is, hey, you're going to do a query, a fast lookup within Flow, and you want to know, well, how many records returned? So you would create a loop, and within that loop, your do something is just going through and saying, hey, here's record 1, here's record 2, here's record 3. It's also really useful for updating those records. So common example would be if you were going to go update all the opportunity products to an opportunity, you would query all the products and then loop through each of those products one at a time and then do something to update that record. Now, again, don't be going through and doing creates and deletes within the loop itself. What the best practice is that you are using the loop portion to identify the records that you're either updating or deleting or creating, and storing them in another collection. And then when you leave the loop, when you get through the last record, you are doing your updates or your creates. Typically, these are things that are going to be doing with one item. You're not going through and saying, I'm going to go take a look at multiple accounts and opportunities all within the loop. Each loop iteration is with one record. And you can only do it with one type of records. So if you have a collection of SObject variables, they're all accounts, all contacts, all opportunities. And when you're looping through them, you're only touching accounts, contacts, and opportunities. And that does put a limit on what you can do effectively with that, but it's still a very powerful tool for a lot of the common things that we need to do. Again, I mentioned that it's really all about SObject collections. You can loop through on regular plain collection, but I can tell you this, I've only done it once in, I don't know, how long has Flow been out? Like 5 years, something like that. So it doesn't happen as commonly as going through and saying, I'm going to loop through a bunch of records. And of course, you want to do everything outside of the loop. When you're dealing with SObject variables and SObject collections, you're going to be using the fast elements. So you're not going to do record creates or record updates. They're all fast lookups, fast creates, fast updates. And that's because the fast actions are specific to work with the SObject variables and the SObject collections. All right, so we talked about the loops, and let's talk a little bit about the scenario for what I'm going to show for the demo. So those of you who may have been following me on social media for the last few years may recall about 6 years ago, I had premature twins born. And as part of that, we had to track all this different information about like the type of diapers that they were having, how often we're feeding them, what we're feeding them, how much we're feeding them. And it was a lot of data that we had to hand write down and then somehow try to collate this. So when we went to the doctor for every week for about 3 months, we can say, hey, this is what kid one is doing, this is what kids two doing. And I'm lazy. Not only was that a very difficult thing for us to do because you're incredibly sleep deprived, but it's also very challenging because you then had to manually read your chicken scratch and try to figure out what to tell the doctor. And so I had created Baby Force, which was a great tool for me back 6 years ago. No longer really fits because I don't have babies. And so I have created something different. My particular pain points are the fact that my wife and I both work. I'm horrendously forgetful. You can ask Jen how many times she had to remind me to send her slide decks and everything else. And I still need to be able to track things like the allowances, the consequences that I handed out to my children, and the consequences that my wife or other caregivers handed out to my children, because we work. And so if my wife said, hey, Amelia, you don't get TV this afternoon, and she forgets to text me, I come home from work and Amelia goes, hey, Dad, I won't want to watch TV. I won't know that she's not supposed to. And so this is a nice way to be able to keep track of who assigned what type of consequence. And of course, we're not the only people who are providing care to our children. Grandparents and aunts can come in. So I need to be able to communicate those consequences out. And the last thing is I need to track chores. So this is my family tracker app, otherwise known as KidForce. And if anyone has a better name, I would love to hear it because my imagination shut down. So what does this look like? Well, that's great because that leads into our demo time. So one of the things that I always run into is the fact that, well, I am lazy. So I could, if I'm going to go through and say, Rose and Amelia, you don't get allowance this week. I could go into Rose's record and I can say, okay, here, I'm going to create a new consequence, maybe use a quick action to do that, save that record, then go to Amelia and do the same thing. But that's a lot of clicks. And busy parents, we don't have time for clicks. So instead, I have on my family record, I have a wonderful area to be able to assign consequences. And what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how this works, and then I'm going to show you how I actually am doing it. So we'll first start with assigning the consequences. So I click Assign Consequences, and I get this wonderful little pop-up, and it tells me a list of my children. We'll select Rose. We'll say she's not getting an allowance. I have my dates pre-defaulted for a week because that seems like a really nice period of time, but I can change that if I wanted to be more lenient or more harsh. And click Next. And it's going to say, hey, do you want to assign another consequence? I go, yeah, Amelia needs one too. So I'll go say yes. And I'll change this to Amelia. Say that she's losing her allowance. And click Next. And then I'm done. I just say no. It's going to go through and says, hey, all the consequences have been assigned. Let's hope their behaviors improve. It gives me a little briefing of who got what for when. And then if I go into our chatter page, I have a group out here for caregiver notification. So everyone who is in my caregiver group is now notified that Rose and Amelia have lost permissions to get their allowance this week. So that's how it looks as an end user. So what's happening behind the scenes? Well, this is all being done in Flow. The button that you see is actually a new type of quick action that you can get. I believe it came out with the summer 17 release to embed a flow within an action, which is amazing. I've been using it all the time. But my flow is fairly straightforward. You can see I have a loop of elements right here, just going back and forth, and we start with our initial screen, which is very simple. It's who's my child, and I'm using a dynamic choice to be able to find out who the children are against the particular family that we're running on. I can have what's my consequences, and again, I'm using a dynamic choice based on the pick list value to be able to say what are the potential consequences I could be assigned. And then I have my start and end dates, both where you can see I'm using a formula to determine what the default start and default end date is. Very, very simple screen. My next element is my do stuff element, where I'm building the consequences. And so right here, this is my SObject variable for consequences. I like to use VR for variable, SO for to represent SObjects to kind of make identifying what my variables mean a lot easier. But the reason why I really like doing this with object variables versus just a whole bunch of variables is because VRSO consequences is one variable with all these different components. So I have my child value, my type, start and end date. This really simplifies the number of variables I have to keep track. And when it comes time to actually making the update, it is a lot easier to do that. And I have a couple other things that I'm adding in here. I'm keeping track of the child that I have selected and what the consequence is. And I'm adding to the chatter message, which is essentially the same thing, but the formula is formatted subtly different because things work a little bit better if you're doing it in a flow screen versus if you're doing it within a chatter post. I have a second assignment here. Now, I technically do not need this assignment. I could have done this as the very last thing that I had in the previous assignment element. But I like doing this because I think it's cleaner and it makes it a lot more obvious that, hey, this is the point where I'm adding something. And in this case, I'm adding my my consequence SObject variable to my collection. And you can see that I have them subtly named differently. I have VRSO for my SObject variable and VRSOCOL to represent my collection. And so I can very quickly see that I am adding a single SObject variable to an SObject collection. Next, I have my screen that says, hey, do you want to assign another consequence? You could put this in the very first screen to be able to say, do you want to assign another one? But I chose to do it as a second screen just to make it a little bit more called out than what it normally would be. And I think it makes the first screen where you're setting the consequence a little bit cleaner. So very simple. It's just a yes/no choice. Now, the key part of this loop is the decision element. And you always have to have at least a decision element somewhere within your element loop, because this is the point where it decides, do you go back to the beginning or do you finish and exit the loop? And in this scenario, it's a very simple two outcome decisions where I have one where if I selected yes, I'm going to go to the beginning. If I didn't select yes, I'm out of the loop. Once I'm out of the loop, this is the point where I create all the records that have been assigned in the element loop. And if I click on the little edit here, This is one of the reasons why I absolutely love SObject variables and their collections, because instead of having to have a long list where I'm specifying every single field that's getting updated in the record lookup, I can do it right here by simply saying, go update all the records or go create all the records within a specific collection or a specific SObject variable. And it's really nice to do it, use this when you're using loops, because you can use one set of variables and not have to create a variable for every single potential record that you may have to create, because you do not want to be creating them within the loop itself. The last 3 bits here is I do a lookup to get the uh, ID of my chatter group. So this is a really simple. I know I'm only going to look up one record. I don't need anything other than the ID, so doing a record lookup made sense for this particular situation. I'm also not doing any updates or against this, so it works really well. I have my chatter post. So here's my ID to my collaboration group, and then I created a text template to actually display the chatter post. And the reason I chose text template is because I like to try to play around to see if I can get rich text to work with my chatter posts. It doesn't work all the time, but I still like to try it out. And then finally, we have the complete screen, which is a really simple display text with the variable that I had set up in my first assignment to say, well, what are the particular consequences and children that have received it. Really simple. So that's a great example of a single loop. Now, when it comes time to paying my children's allowance, I would need to create a record for each of my children, and then I would have to make a determination, hey, if they had the no allowance consequence, I shouldn't create the record. And by the end of the day, I'm tired. I'm also lazy. I don't want to have to do a lot of thinking to figure out who do I need to pay and who do I not need to pay. I'm going to let Salesforce tell me. So I have another action here that calls a flow to pay allowances. And it's a real simple one. It says, do you want to pay allowances to all applicable children? I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to click next. And I'm effectively done. 2 clicks to create potentially 3 records or 1 record for every child in my family. And in this particular situation, Flo went through and said, hey, we noticed that Rose and Amelia have an active consequences that they don't get allowance. And so we did not create a record for their allowance. And now I know, okay, I don't need to pay Rose and I don't need to pay Amelia. And we can see here that Lucian here is the only one who got paid, and my wallet's actually a lot thankful for that because it's only $2.50. I don't have to worry about that too much. But I have this nice little update here on the side. I can keep track of the fact of how much I'm paying who. So let's take a look at this particular flow. This flow is a little bit more convoluted, but what I'm doing is I start by looking up all the children. And in my particular org, I'm actually using contacts as the object for children because there's no need to create a new children when I have a perfectly good object here. So all I'm doing is saying, hey, go find all the children that are under a specific account, and I'm going to save them all into a collection. So this collection is going to hold either 0 or more, 1 or more records of contacts that represent my children, depending upon which family is paying the allowance. Now I have my allowance payout, which goes through and says, hey, do you want to pay out to all children or not? Really simple, some display text, and then a choice to be able to say yes or no. And then I have a decision. And I'm going to admit this. I was lazy. I only created the output to say if you're going to pay out for everyone, because I wasn't going to pay out to only specific children, regardless of the fact that they had the consequence amount. So if I selected no, my flow simply just ends and no one gets paid. But here, all I'm doing is checking to see, did I say yes or no? I said yes. And now this is where we start our loop. So in this particular loop, all I'm doing is looping through my children. And so here's our collection of children. And I have to say, well, what does one item in this collection, where does that get stored? And that's the loop variable down here. So you'll see that I have a VRSO child as my SObject variable. and that represents one record that is within the SObject collection. So then I come down and I essentially go through and say, I'm going to go ahead, and I went the wrong direction, didn't I? I did go the wrong direction. I need to go to my decision. The first step of my decision is to be able to say, hey, I need to know, should I pay this child an allowance or not? And so I'm looking at the field for no allowance on my VRSL child. So this is one record within the collection to see whether or not they have the consequence assigned or not. If it's false, they don't have the consequence. So if it's false, I come down and say, okay, great, I get to pay their allowance. And I do a very similar setup that we saw before, where I define, okay, what is the value for the allowance record that you're creating? And this one's really simple. It simply says, what is the amount that we're paying them? I'm getting this off of my child record. I'm saying what child is getting that payment, and what's the date that I'm paying them, and that would be the date that we're running the flow. And then this particular one is just adding my allowance SObject variable to my SObject collection for allowance. If I said don't pay them, or they had the no consequence, it's coming through, and all I'm doing here is saying, hey, I'm going to go through and say there's at least one child that is not going to get allowance, and I'm storing what that child is. So that way, when I get to the very last end of my screen, I can display that list. So once I end my loop and I'm gone through all my children in the collection, I go ahead and I create all my allowances. Again, I love this because I'm only having to do one variable for all the records I'm updating. And then I have a choice, another decision. And that's because if I had children who didn't get allowance, I was going to show a different screen, and that's the screen that we saw, which contains the list of the children who didn't get paid. And if no one didn't get their allowance, so if everyone got paid, then I showed a slightly different screen that had the variable in it. And that's the end of the flow. Not very complex, it's very simple, but extremely powerful because you can save a lot of work in creating records or multiple records without having to do a lot of button clicks. Okay. So that is the two flows as examples as SObject variables and collections. Before I move on, Jen, do we have any questions?
I do not see any queued up at the moment.
No questions queued up. Very quiet group today. Okay. So I'm gonna end my demo with something special. And I'm not gonna necessarily show you how I do this, but I'm gonna show you what I can do with the power of automation within Salesforce. And to do that, I'm gonna turn on my webcam. Okay, so on my screen right here, that is obviously not me, despite the fact that there is a wizard hat on it. This little device, this is called Jibo. Jibo is kind of like your smart speakers that you would get from Amazon or for Google, but it has a bit more of a personality because it can move around and so forth. It's also not as smart as those two other options, but I can connect it with Salesforce. And the reason I've done this is because sometimes when you're in the heat of the moment and your children are really misbehaving, you don't have time to whip out your phone and go into Salesforce One or find your nearest computer and sit down and assign consequences. Sometimes you simply just need to assign the consequence then and there. So, hey Jibo, abracadabra, ground all my children.
I'll do my best.
And just like that,
Okay, I've got something to share. Want to hear it?
No. Have I mentioned it's
Maybe
not as
next
smart?
time.
So now, if I go ahead and I refresh my screen in Salesforce, I can see that all my children have received the grounded consequence. That is very cool. I don't know about you, but as a parent, I love the fact that I can assign the consequences by voice command. So I'm going to leave you as we wait for potential questions here for the blatant self-promotion that I promised at the very beginning of the agenda. We do have the Wizardcast podcast, which I do with Mark Ross. We often talk about automation and other Salesforce things, and we try to be funny. I don't know if we are actually funny, but we try to be funny. So if you like something a little bit different with your Salesforce podcast, check us out. We're on iTunes, a whole bunch of other places. And you can find us at thewizardnews.com, where I post everything I do, from blogs to the video trainers to the podcast. I'm also blogging at the company site, betterpartners.com/blog. We do a lot more different topics on there, but if you like the stuff that I'm putting out on the Wizard News and you want more of it, that is another place they can check out. And if you want to learn more about Flow, I do have a number of videos out on my YouTube. You can do a search for Wizard Apprentice on YouTube, or Wizard Apprentice and just my name, Brian, on there, and you'll find it. Or just go to thewizardnews.com and you'll find links to all the various Wizard Apprentice episodes that I have done. And with that, Jen, I think we're set for any questions and comments.
I'm just staring at Jibo. I'm amused by that.
Jibo. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty awesome.
Yeah, I wish it was a little bit smarter.
Honestly, I don't know what this means.
Right? Not quite smart enough. But it's pretty cute. My children love it. Yeah, my children talk to it all the time. It's hilarious to watch. When I showed them a smart speaker, they didn't know what to do with it. I literally had this open on the table, and they immediately started trying to talk to it. So don't know what it is. Even though it's not as smart as the other smart speakers, it definitely captures the attention more.
So the questions that we're getting are asking about your Jibo integration, and not your flows.
Fine. Okay. Do people really want to know how I did it? They want to.
Yes, you're seeing yes.
Yeah.
Just because it's automation hour, and just because it's Jenner and Kesh, I'll show you. So the way that I have this set up with Jibo is there is a site called If This Then That. And I did not have this set up, so I have to go ahead and finish signing in. So 1 second here as I sign in on the other side. Let's see. Is that the right password? No, of course it's not the right password. Let's try this one. Hey, okay, it worked. So here's a site. It's called If This Then That. Jibo and Salesforce both have little services up there, so you can go through and do a lot of things with this then that with Salesforce and other devices. Both having things where something happens in Salesforce and then it connects to If This Then That and then does something someplace else. Or in this case, I'm using Jibo, so when I tell Jibo this particular word, I'm going through and I'm creating a record. Whoop. Didn't like my scrolling on this. It's creating a record in Salesforce. It's passing over the command. It's passing in some other information. In this case, because it's just me in my house, I'm going to hard code my value of who the family is. And what this does is it creates a record. And that particular record is a voice command record, which is a custom object. And within the custom object, I'm using Process Builder to go through and basically say, hey, whenever a new command gets created, go ahead and call my flow. And my flow is for the mass consequences. And all I'm doing is saying, okay, pass in this case, the account ID and the type of command. So in my situation, I'm really making it easy where I'm going ahead and I'm querying all my children based on the family ID that came in. I loop through them. And in this particular situation, I am assigning the consequences. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. I'm going to the consequences based on the consequence that is assigned in the record that got created. So all I'm doing is build up my consequence record, and then I do a fast create to create the record. That's it. The downside to doing this method is if you're going to have a lot of fancy commands to it, you do have to create something that will identify what command you need to do where. So if you wanted to do, say, create opportunities for specific accounts, you do need to be able to have your custom object that you use to store the record coming in from Jibo or wherever else it's coming in, to be able to parse out the different pieces. So you can say, okay, this part of the command that's coming in is identifying, say, the account name, and this is identifying the dollar value for the opportunity, or whatever the case may be. So you can parse out the different things coming in from the voice command, and then use that within Flow to say, okay, this is what I'm actually need to do. So it is not what you call an extremely flexible voice command situation, but as you can see, it can be very effective if you have things that you're going to do over and over again, like grounding my children.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can do this. At Dreamforce, actually, I think it's one of the sessions, Jen, that you stalked me and Mark at. At Dreamforce a couple years ago, we used Evernote and Workato to do a very similar type of thing. But I didn't want to use Workato in this particular case because you have to pay for it. If this, then that is free. And so all I really had to pay for was the really expensive toy here. But if I didn't have that, you could probably do something very similar with the other smart speakers that are on the market.
Great. We're going to give a minute or so for those of you out there who might have questions about Brian's other part of his presentation, or if you have a general process automation question.
You know, why are you doing this, Jen? I need to go through because I did do some chores today that I forgot to update. So let me go through and update those. Let's see, and I think Rose did feed the cats, and that's all that's been done. Okay. And if anyone wants to volunteer to do some of these chores, I'll be happy to sign them up for them. No questions.
I think Rakesh just volunteered.
Thanks to everyone. This might be the first time I do a presentation where I did it so well that no one has any questions about what I talked about. That must have been amazingly clear.
Someone said they have eggnog hangover.
See, what did I tell you, Jen? Doing it on the 22nd, Friday before the winter holiday, attendance might be spotty.
All right, well, I'm not going to hold folks any longer. Thank you, Brian, for this presentation. This was a really cool idea for using something outside of work, using flows, and the whole Jibo thing is pretty cool. I'm just mesmerized by it. And it's moving its head and all that.
Yeah, I mean, you could do this for work as well. You know, I just didn't have anything where I needed a real voice command for my company. And I wasn't about to hook Jibo up to my company's org just because I don't know if I can trust Jibo. Hey, Jibo, can I trust you?
I wish I knew about that, but I don't.
See, even Jibo doesn't know if I can trust it.
That's awesome. All right, well, for those on, we're going to sign off. Thank you for joining us for our last 2017 session of the year for Automation Hour, for your continued support. We're looking forward to future sessions in 2018. And Brian, thanks so much for wrapping this series up for us this year.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really excited for the next three that you have. Doug is amazing. And I'm kind of jealous that you got Alex to come on to talk about the stuff coming out in spring. There's some really cool stuff coming out in automation. Don't want to miss it.
Great. And with that, we're going to sign off. Thank you.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks. Bye-bye.